In this video, I'm going to show you how to use inline macros, how to use them to customize your abilities further to enhance immersion and roleplay, and how to use some query-based macros to give you more options when using your abilities and your spells. So before I start, I will do what I do every time. I turn on Talk to Myself. And then I want to show you a few things that you can do in the Roll20 chat box. So we've talked about how the chat box processes any kind of macro that you type within it. One really cool thing that you can do in Roll20 as opposed to in a real life game is that you have the ability to roleplay in the background while there's another scene or conversation happening in the foreground. And the reason we can do that is because we have two modes of communication. We can speak with each other over voice, and we can talk with each other through text. So in Roll20, if you go to the chat box and you type /me, and then you type any other message after, it'll display it in a highlighted roleplay format so that it narrates what your character is doing. So for example, if I type /me takes a cookie from the jar, I'm going to type one more message just so you can see the whole thing. It displays it in an orange text, italicized, and it's bolded. So that is roleplay text, and it means that my character is doing this in the background while something else is happening in the foreground. And this allows me to roleplay without distracting from the main narrative. And you can do this as any other character as well. So any character you have access to, you can switch in this drop-down menu. So for example, if I want to speak as Levy, one of my Eldritch Cannons, I can do /me shoots a Firebolt. And you can see it narrates a little message for me. Now we can take this a step further by using a very, very simple inline macro. So one thing that Roll20's chat does is it can process rolls and calculations. So let's say I don't want to just take one cookie, I want to take a randomly determined amount of cookies based on a dice roll. So I can do /me takes 1d6 cookies from the jar. Now if I send this message out the way it is, you'll see that it just says 1d6 cookies. But we can actually tell Roll20 to process that 1d6 as a dice roll. So to do that, I'm going to put square brackets around the 1d6, and the square brackets tells Roll20 that this is a calculation, and it tells it to roll that 1d6. So now I've taken 6 cookies from the jar. And it doesn't end there. Roll20 also can do some math within this. So let's say I want to take 1d6 times 10. In Roll20, if you want to do times, it's the asterisk. Roll20 automatically rolls the 1d6 and then multiplies it by 10 to give me 10 cookies from the jar. So with this very, very simple macro, you can begin to see various ways that you can spice up some of your abilities and your features. Because if you recall, anything that is displayed in the chat can use these macros. So for example, if I head into one of my attacks, let's say this cantrip has a special property that deals an extra 1d8 damage to undead enemies. I could just write in the description of the attack, if undead deal an extra square brackets 1d8 damage. And then if I roll this attack, you can see at the bottom here, if undead, deal an extra 2 damage. And if I hover over it, I can see that I rolled a 1d8 there. So this will roll every time, and it's small enough that I can ignore it, but it's also noticeable enough where if the circumstance happens where I am fighting an undead, I don't have to roll any extra dice because it's already rolled in the description of the attack here. So if you don't want to use the second damage box or a pop-up query asking if the enemy is undead, you could just do this and it'll roll it for you every time. So this is just another option to display extra damage if you want to use it. Now, this inline macro is really useful for things like features and traits. So on this character, I actually have a number of Eldritch Cannons, which I also call my familiars. They can be interchanged. And my Eldritch Cannons, they have attacks and abilities that they can use as a part of my bonus action. So Krako here is a Protector Eldritch Cannon, and what he can do is, as a bonus action on my turn, I can tell him to give temporary hit points to himself and any ally within 10 feet of him. So this Protector skill here grants 1d8 plus 5 temporary hit points, and I just put that within the description of his feature so that anytime I roll that feature, it will roll the 1d8 plus 5 temp hit points automatically, and it shows that everyone gets 9 temporary hit points. Next, we're going to take these inline macros a little bit further. Some of you have noticed in one of the previous videos where I talked about Divine Smite, I also had a macro called Lay on Hands. And what Lay on Hands does is this macro uses 2 different kinds of inline macros. It uses a targeted macro and an input query. So what I do is if I click this macro, I'll get this little message up here to choose a target. So this is the target of who I want to use Lay on Hands on. So let's say I want to cast Lay on Hands on Kevin here. I click on his token, and I'm going to say I want to heal him for 10 points. If I submit that, in the chat, you see it'll display, I lay my hands on... Oh, there's no name here because Kevin's token actually has no name assigned to it. If I chose someone like Wu Mei here, who has a name, then you'll see it display Wu Mei. So you can see that the macro isn't flawless. If the token you choose does not have a name assigned to it, it won't display it. But most of the time you're going to be using Lay on Hands on named NPCs and your allies. But if they have a name assigned to it, then it'll display in the roleplay chat that you use Lay on Hands on them for 10 hit points. And this is really helpful because there have been many times where I've seen people use things like Healing Word or Lay on Hands or any other kind of healing on another player, and then maybe 2-3 minutes later they ask again, hey, how many points did you heal me for again? Well, if this is displayed in the chat, they don't really have an excuse because it shows their name and it shows them how many hit points that they've recovered. So they could always just check the chat to make sure that they've added those hit points and it's no longer your fault. I mean, it was never your fault, but you know. So this targeted macro, I'm going to show you now, uses this target modifier. So by saying target there, it means I'm going to choose a target, and then I put token name so that it uses the name of the token. So you just click on the token, it chooses them, and then this is the macro for input query. These will be put in the video description below. So it's going to ask how many hit points do you want, and you could input anything. You could put numbers, you could put a word, like you could put rope or whatever, and it'll just display whatever that is in place of what 10 is here. But that's one way that I like to use lay on hands. And then I just go into my features and I subtract 10 points of lay on hands, and we can move on. And now the last type of query I want to talk about is the Dropdown Query. So I demonstrated this in one of the previous videos, but I have cantrip level 1 and level 2 spell macros here. Now these macros unfortunately aren't the most complicated macros because Roll20 can't really handle nesting macros at the moment. If the macros are too complicated, Roll20 just doesn't work. So as much as I would love to click this macro and be able to choose like acid splash and have it roll the damage by calling out this macro that I have here, it can't do that. So instead, what I have these spell macros do is it displays either a picture or a description of the spell so that it enhances the roleplay that we can do in the game. So if I click Acid Splash, it displays a GIF like so into the chat box, and it just gives people an image of what the spell looks like. For things like Acid Splash, these aren't really that important, but some spells, for example, Fairy Fire, it's nice to be able to see what's happening. So to do this, we use a very similar type of query to what we used in Lay on Hands, but this is a drop-down query. So if I go over to my cantrips here, and I have Acid Splash and Firebolt. Again, I will put this in the video description below, but this choose a spell is basically the question that's going to be displayed when the pop-up appears, and then Acid Splash is the name of the choice that's going to appear in the drop-down box. Then I put a comma, and I just put either the description of the spell or a picture of the spell, whatever you want to have it displayed. And then you need to use a vertical bar to separate all the different choices within the drop-down box. And you can add as many choices as you'd like. And this is the kind of thing that you could use for a variety of different abilities. So for example, if you're like a barbarian and you have maybe 50 different catchphrases for when you go into a rage, you could have a macro that just says like rage 1, I go into a rage, and that vertical bar, rage 2, I go berserk. You have all these different catchphrases that you could just choose from a drop down box. It enhances the roleplay. It's fun, and it's just a neat thing to have. If you are interested in these spell gifts that I have here, we didn't create them ourselves. I actually bought them off of Deck of Many. So again, I'll put the link in the video description below, but this guy has been creating a number of spell gifts that you can purchase, and they have from cantrips to level 5 at the moment, and there's a Kickstarter for level 6 to 9, but you can buy those. Otherwise, you could just use any picture that you find off Google, any GIF that you find off Google, and just have them play whenever you want to cast a spell. If you want to put a picture, what you need to do is you do a square bracket, you put an X. We have an X here just so that it fulfills the condition, but you could put any text you want. It just needs to have some sort of text between the first square brackets. and then you do a round bracket, and within the round brackets you put in the link of the picture. And then if you push enter, Roll20 will read that you are trying to post a picture, and it'll post it in the chat right there.